So in this video, we'll be discussing comparison essays and how to write them. And I have sort of 4 steps to go through when you're writing a comparison essay. The first one is you have to establish a basis of comparison, basically meaning you have to decide what's similar or what's different between the two things that you're comparing. You have to do the second step, which is to gather information and brainstorm possible similarities and differences. The third step is to develop a thesis statement that you can revise as needed. And the fourth one is to organize your comparison essay. And you'll do that usually using one of 2 different methods. I'm sure there's other methods, but these are the sort of 2 most common organizational structural methods used for a comparison essay. So just a comparison essay in general usually looks at the similarities and differences between 2 things. It could be 2 texts, it could be 2 authors, it could be 2 artists, it could be 2 different time periods, it could be 2 countries, anything that you want to sort of assess those similarities and differences between. So that's what we're going to look at today in our discussion. You might also have this assignment as a compare and contrast essay. That would be the same thing as a comparison essay or a comparative essay. So it's basically all the same type of assignment. So what is a comparison essay? A comparison essay assesses the similarities and differences between 2 or more texts, characters, ideologies, periods of time, etc. So in my class, in an English class, we usually compare texts. So it might be a poem and a film, it might be a novel and a short story. So different text-based comparisons. We might keep our focus on a theme that's common to the 2 texts, or we might focus on characters and how they have similar characteristics in common, even despite the differences in the 2 texts. So there's lots of different criteria that you can use for the basis of your comparison. You want to have some sort of similarity between the texts that you select, because that will help sort of unify your paper around a central idea. So whether that's a similar theme or similar characteristics between, 2 characters, you need some sort of tie in common, and that will help build this unified discussion as the foundation of your comparison essay. Something to also keep in mind as a guiding question is, why am I comparing these 2 things? What insights can be gained from comparing these 2 things? And, what lessons can be learned by comparing these 2 texts or these 2 characters or these 2 topics? So you want to try to get something from the comparison, if possible, and gain that insight by the end of the comparison. So your basis of comparison is kind of the first step. So this is basically narrowing down what are the 2 things, usually 2 or more things that you're placing side by side and assessing in comparison with each other. So in my class, it's usually 2 different texts, and that could be a reading or a film. You might focus in on 2 different characters and what they have in common, or how they act differently in their similar situation. It might be 2 different situations, or a similar situation and 2 different outcomes. So there's lots of sort of variations, but you want to have some sort of basis of comparison. Is it going to be characteristics, qualities, time period, ideology, text, whatever it is, you have to have decide what 2 or more things you're going to compare. And then your next step is going to be sort of brainstorming, and I like to sort of do a couple of different brainstorming sessions when I'm thinking of what to write, because you kind of narrow it down as you go along in your brainstorming. So you might start off with just similarities and differences and have sort of a column for each of those. And so you might, if you're looking at different texts, you might say both text A and text B share this theme in common. And that might be one way to get started in coming up with a thesis statement. Or you might say, okay, maybe I'll focus on characters. So both character A and character B have this in common. They might both be young. They might both be female. They might both be male. They might be both, adolescents, or they might be both inquisitive, or they might be flawed. So they might have this characteristic in common, even though they have completely different situations. Or they might both be, heroic characters that we admire, but for different reasons, that kind of thing. And then we can also have a column discussing the differences. And obviously there's going to be a lot of differences and, different authors, different time periods, different settings, different writing styles, that kind of thing. So you really are going to narrow it down to like the main difference that you see and how that relates to basically the similarities first, and then figure out what the main difference that you want to discuss is going to be. So you don't want to make differences the main topic of your essay, if that makes sense. You want to kind of focus on the similarities first, and then you can differentiate later in your essays. So for example, in my class, we take the text Frankenstein, and we also study A Doll's House. So you might set up a little graph or chart or piece of paper and brainstorm some similarities and differences between these two texts. So on the surface, they're very different. One is a science fiction novel. The other is, a Victorian era play set in Norway. One is about this scientific experiment gone wrong. We have Victor Frankenstein creating a creature. And then the other one is around, a marriage that falls apart. Another difference is that the main character in Frankenstein is a man. He's a scientific young man who's, made this fatal error and created this new life, this monster. And in comparison, or in contrast, the protagonist of A Doll's House is a young woman, a mother, a wife, and on the surface they don't have a lot in common, right? Very different circumstances and priorities in life. Victor's very educated, a man of science. Nora is very uneducated, and her life revolves around her domestic duties, her marriage, her being a mother. So on the surface, very, very different. So the connection becomes, okay, how can I pull these two characters together? What can I find in common? So these were a couple that I sort of brainstormed. So both Victor and Nora make mistakes, or can be seen as making bad decisions, depending on your perspective. So Victor makes the mistake of creating this monster. Right? He was fueled with good intentions, but his good intentions went wrong when he created this monstrous being. Nora can also be viewed as making a fatal mistake. She had good intentions to help her husband, but she committed a crime when she forged her father's signature to get the loan, and now she's being blackmailed, and it's, this threat that looms over destroying her husband's reputation and ruining their marriage. Another similarity, both Victor and Torvald, Nora's husband, are very arrogant men. So maybe if you wanted to focus on gender, you could compare the male characters in those two texts. Both Nora and Victor's creature could also be compared as oppressed figures, but for different reasons. So Nora is a female character in a very patriarchal world. So as a woman, she is kind of oppressed by gender inequality in society and in her marriage. For Victor's creature, he's, viewed as other, disfigured, monstrous, unhuman. So he's oppressed for different reasons based on his physical appearance, and the perception of his, ableism, I guess, in society, viewing him as other. So they're both oppressed. So that might be an interesting theme to focus on. And then the theme of abandonment could also be a similarity. Victor abandons his creature. Nora eventually will abandon her husband and children. So that might be a theme that we explore more in our paper. So again, I wouldn't talk about all of these things in your paper. You really need to pick one central theme or idea and perhaps narrow it down that way. But this is just an initial brainstorming idea session. And I think it's a good idea to sort of just brainstorm a ton of similarities and a ton of differences, and then look at that list and figure out which theme or idea or topic sparks your interest the most. So you don't have to talk about all of these things, but maybe, when I was doing this list, the theme of abandonment really sparked my interest. So I might want to explore that one in my paper. So I might, as a secondary exercise, do another brainstorm session just on the theme of abandonment between these two texts, and start again with similarities and differences. So on a similar level, Victor abandons his creature. Nora abandons her husband and her children. So they both have that in common. Also, the other similarity would be both Victor and Nora having made mistakes in their past and sort of suffering the negative consequences of their decisions. The differences, again, this is maybe how you perceive the differences as the reader. These are how I perceive the differences. You might have a slightly different interpretation. But I interpreted Victor's abandonment as a result of his failure to nurture his creature, the monster that he creates. He's initially repulsed by it, and I view him as sort of being very selfish in his abandonment. I have more sympathy for Nora as a character. So I view Nora's abandonment of her husband and children in a more sympathetic light than I do Victor's. You could view her as selfish as well, but I do think that she, in her situation as a woman in a patriarchal society, needs that opportunity for personal development that she has not had in life before. So her abandonment seems a little bit more sympathetic or justified, at least in my perspective. You might view it differently. And then you can come up with a thesis statement, and this thesis statement might change or evolve as you go through or start drafting your essay. But if I was going to write a thesis statement based on my brainstorming session, and I was going to tackle this topic or this theme of abandonment as my main focus, and compare Victor and Nora, I would say, start with similarities and differences, and try to address both of those in my thesis statement. So try to develop a thesis statement that identifies the main focus and the sort of results of your comparison. So in this case, my main focus is going to be on abandonment in the two texts, and then how I perceive the differences between why those two characters abandoned their offspring. So my thesis statement is both Victor from Shelley's Frankenstein and Nora from Ibsen's A Doll's House abandoned their roles as caregivers, and both can be seen as failed parents. However, Victor's failure comes from his own personal flaw and pride, whereas Nora's failure as a mother originates from gender inequalities in her society, in her marriage, and in her upbringing. So this is sort of my interpretation of this comparison essay. Yours, again, might be different. But I want to convey this idea that, you know, Nora's failure is not necessarily as just her fault as maybe Victor's is. So I want to establish her as the product of her own environment and society. So if that's my working thesis, I can, again, the next step will be to outline my essay and organize the comparison. So I suggest writing out an outline, and there's two standard methods by which to create your comparison essay: the block method and the point-by-point method. Both have, you know, qualities that make them effective in a comparison. The block method is maybe more simplified. So you'll talk about text one. So I might talk about Victor and Frankenstein first, and then I'll talk about Nora in A Doll's House, and then I'll have body paragraph number 3 where I talk about Victor and Nora together in one paragraph. So it's kind of, you know, first you talk about them separately, and then you synthesize that information in your third paragraph. The point-by-point method is a little bit more complex on the surface. You're going to talk about both text 1 and text 2 in each of your key points. You might only have 2 points here. You don't necessarily have to have the third one. So it really just depends on how many points you want to discuss. But you might say, you know, similarities, text 1, text 2, differences, text 1, text 2. So you'll talk about Victor and Nora in each of your body paragraphs. So let's take a closer look at these two methods and how you might organize this hypothetical paper that we are coming up with. So for the block method, you'll have your introduction with your thesis statement, and then the body of your essay. We still have 3 paragraphs, but we're going to talk about Victor's abandonment of his creature in your first body paragraph. Then you're going to talk about Nora's abandonment of her children or of her marriage in body paragraph number 2. And then body paragraph 3, you're going to talk about them both together. So you're going to sort of synthesize and discuss Victor and Nora together and assess, you know, what's similar or different about them, or how you view that differences once you look at them side by side. And then you have your conclusion paragraph as well. The point-by-point method, you could have your introduction with your thesis statement, and then you'll have body paragraph 1 talking about both Nora and Victor in the same paragraph. So body paragraph 1, both Nora and Victor make mistakes / bad decisions, might be my first paragraph. Body paragraph 2, both Nora and Victor abandon their offspring. And then body paragraph 3, while both Nora and Victor are flawed characters and make mistakes, they differ in their reasons why they abandon others. So I would maybe go into a little bit more depth about why I think each of them ended up taking the same action, but for different reasons. And then your conclusion as well. So these are sort of 2 methods that you can use to organize your paper. You could even simplify this further and just do similarities between Nora and Victor in one paragraph, and then differences between Nora and Victor in your second paragraph, and then your conclusion. So that would be sort of another simplified way to do it. But again, try to select the outline or method of comparison that fits your needs and your thesis statement. So if you're going to focus on similarities and then differentiate, you might want to show that, organize your thoughts first with an outline before you start writing, so you have a nice clear path for your comparison essay.